shopkeepers, others nurses, and teachers to elite children, and still other agricultural laborers. In exploring the potential outcomes of their enslavement, various strands of evidence suggested that women were often sex trafficked. A captive's initial experience of sexual violence is only the first step in their experience of human trafficking. For women, the slave trade always involved and still involves the constant danger of sex trafficking. Their experience constitutes more than slavery. So I just wanted to flash up some modern sex trafficking statistics today here in Britain, just to kind of get our minds wrapped around this idea. In 2016, an estimated 40.3 million people worldwide were in modern slavery, and 15.4 million people in forced marriages. 70% of these are women and girls. Women and girls account for 99% of victims in the global commercial sex industry. So the UN in 2000 defined the trafficking human beings here. The key aspects of this definition I want to point out, though, are transportation, transfer by means of threat or use of force, the abuse of a position of vulnerability, and the giving or receiving of payments for the purpose of exploitation. The captive women of Rome were not recruited, but physically forced to submit before, during, or after battle. They were then transported to Rome or one of its provinces, one that might not have been their last stop. Some were then chosen to be put on display in a triumph for the victorious general, others then sent to the slave market. During the capture, transportation, and sale of these women, they were most certainly threatened, used by force, coerced, deceived, and exploited sexually. We can therefore define them as trafficking victims and the art conducted against them as trafficking. So I kind of have a call to action here. The captive women not only serve the purpose of displaying the destruction of the complete family unit, but in the context of war, were also really real prized possessions, trophies to be owned and won and treated in any way the owner wished, including for sexual gratification. Slave girls and women were therefore in a physically and morally vulnerable position. However, the topic of sexual exploitation of foreign women in the Roman world has been extremely limited because of our Victorian Puritanism, acculturation, and ideas regarding sex. This has resulted in a minimal number of scholars willing to discuss this topic directly and without blanket terms like slavery to obliquely describe the acts committed against subdued foreign peoples. The time is ripe, I argue, to explore properly and consider openly the realities lived by the dominated and enslaved other in Roman antiquity, and how this reality was displayed and read in Roman art. In current scholarship, the purchasing of slaves for the purpose of sex and the sexual autonomy of the master over the slave is discussed under the umbrella of slavery. I would argue, however, that this blanket term is not adequate or accurate, and I would make a case for acknowledging this practice in terms of sex trafficking as we understand it today. While the term sex trafficking does not appear in the Latin language, at least to my current knowledge, there is considerable textual evidence for the denigration of unfree individuals whose bodies were at the disposal of others, and for the circulation of attractive slaves for the sexual pleasure of those in power and control. We must start to use more differentiated language when we talk about the women conquered by Rome. So recently, two authors have come out with debate articles labeling Roman imperialism as predatory regimes. Here, the authors introduced the alternative notion of a predatory political economy for conceptualizing the late Republican and early imperial Rome. The concept of the predatory regime is, quote, characterized by the militarization of power and trade, pillage as an economic strategy, the pursuit of private interest under public command, and the convergence of brute force into legitimate authority. The aim is to eliminate the darker sides of Roman expansionism in order to produce a more balanced and inclusive account. The aim of this work is to show the brutality involved in expansionism and imperialism. If we are to have an inclusive, balanced account of the past, we need the dark sides as well, argue these authors. Feminist says that, quote, she thinks this concept seems relevant and wonders if classical archaeologists will be willing to engage in a meaningful debate around ancient Rome as a predatory regime. I think we're ready to engage in this meaningful debate. My intent here is not to demonize Rome, but aim at providing an inclusive, balanced account of the past to show the brutality involved in imperialism, specifically regarding the taking of captive foreign women, and to explore the process of this dark side to make visible the real-life suffering and oppression of these women. So really quickly, I just kind of want to go into the background of attitudes towards captives, And then I will move on to gender discourse in the conquered, and then I will talk about my theories and methodologies that I have used, and we'll look at how those are applied. So Romans believed that women, when necessary, could even be used as hostages and captives in threatening and coercive ways. Dionysius, writing the first session of the plebs here, is stating that by potentially torturing the wives and other family members, these captives and hostages will be trained to avoid conflict with Rome at all costs. Instead, they will resort to treaties and submit themselves to whatever was asked of them, unarmed. Rape must be one of these ignominious tortures, an act that, quote, inscribes the impotence of defeated men through violated bodies of their women, quote. Rape is the first forceful act of submission. William Harris argues that almost every year the legions went out and did mass violence to someone, and this regularity gives the phenomenon a pathological character. Cicero states that rape is a custom of war, and Virgil equates the enslavement of captives with rape. At the same time, Dionysius of Halicarnassus labels rape as essential for a captive. Wartime rape committed by the Romans, therefore, can be classified as a manifestation of pathological character to uphold the custom of war and an essential act that is expected to befall a captive woman. The sex trade in females in the ancient Roman world is all but invisible. By modern definition, to understand sex trafficking better, it must be referenced to a patriarchal gender order that is predicated on the subordination of women to men, shifting focus to vulnerability. This definition applies to the context of Roman patriarchy. In her essay, Women on the Market, Luce Idigati describes the commodity of the woman in wartime as, quote, divided into two irreconcilable bodies, her natural body and her socially valued, exchangeable body, which is particularly mimetic expression of masculine values, end quote. The elusiveness of the sex trade in captive females in Rome can be attributed, moreover, to the patriarchal gender order that relies on the subordination of women to men through the act of rape, producing shame for her and the body politic, an anecdote that normalizes the expendability and vulnerability of their bodies. Separated from their families, they become invisible chattel in the sex trade. However, we can trace the actions committed in this visible trade on conquest iconography through the desire to display her as war booty, a trophy to be won and taken by force. So there is a gender discourse between the conquered. Under the Principate, war was banished to the social and geographic periphery, always conducted on the distant frontiers, leaving the citizens with only the highly politicized monumental and private art depicting captive women. There is a gender discourse to imperialism in which the enemy was feminized. This discourse is rooted in the social and military discipline of the Roman male. The act of war itself was expressed as phallic, sexual penetration, as evidenced from the Persenoi glandis lead slingshots used by Octavian's besieging army in Perugia in 4140 BC, which can be seen here at the bottom right-hand side. This was against Lucius Antonius, which was Mark Antony's brother, and Fulvia, Mark Antony's ex-wife. The Latin word for sling bullet is glans, originally meaning acorn. Glans was used by ancient medical writers to describe the tip of the penis, the actual shot itself symbolizing the Roman male sexual persona, the phallus, ready to penetrate. Two examples of the obscenities etched into the slingshot directed at Fulvia are, quote, "Ball Lucius Antonius and Fulvia, open up your asshole," and, quote, "I seek Fulvia's clitoris." Clitoris was regarded as one of the crudest obscenities in the Roman world. Judith Hallett suggests that the Romans employed the sexual terms in the vernacular of sexual activity to vent feelings of military hostility. Additionally, Sarah Fink notes that the political and social assimilation of non-Romans could be represented as marriage, articulated through imperialism in gendered terms such as rape and enslavement. Elements of sexual coercion existed in Roman marriages. The rape of the Sabine women by Roman captors to force the assimilation of the Sabines to Roman rule is one of many famous Roman tales of rape and marriage. This link with marriage, capture, and rape provides the propensity for the Roman males to associate captive women with rape. It should be remembered, though, that Rome was not continuously at war during this period of study, and not every Roman soldier in the professional army saw combat, rendering this aspect of masculinity untested for some. Conquest art, therefore, is an outlet for this masculinity to be tested and expressed, educating the soldier onlookers who never experienced battle, how masculinity to be used, and in this context, how it's supposed to look. The art can also act as a placeholder for men who have not tested their masculinity in this way. The art does it for them. So on to a few of the theories that I have used and will apply to examples that I'll talk about in a minute. The first is wartime rape theory. Kathy Gaka did a study on different types of wartime tactics and their associated rapes, and I've applied these to the contextual war times for the monuments. So we have predatory, which is sexual in nature, and it's the taking of women and girls and captives as an objective. Parasitic, which the conquerors don't forcibly remove the women, but they try to kill all the men or enslave them and then take the place of the men. And then we have expansionist, which is the desire to conquer land and resources, women here being a resource. In this instance, women are beaten and raped and subjugated. If predatory and or retaliatory inform expansionist goals, then the taking of women and girls to be concubines, prostitutes, and slaves remains a main objective. Retaliatory is aggressive military action motivated by a genuine grievance. In this instance, women are mostly gang raped. So then moving on to feminist film theory, which I also apply to the reading of the art. Feminist film theorist E.N. Kaplan explains the construction of the observer as male and observed as female, and her essay is The Gaze Male, which I argue can also be applied to assessing Roman art. Additionally, feminist film theorist Mary Ann Doan, in her analysis of the male gaze, argues that the categorized alignment of observed and observer is one in which the male is the mover of narrative, while the female's association with space or matter deprives her of her subjectivity. There is a clear gendered relationship between the viewer and the viewed in Roman art. According to Natalie Campen, there are two contradictory notions when imagining such gender relationships, revealing the instability of gender and gender thinking. First, the Roman object is like the conquered, enslaved, or woman to the extent that it is possessible, feminizing the works of art to make the possessor more powerful like a man, even if the possessor is a woman. If the object is feminized in some way, Campen says the very act of Roman looking can be understood as active and possessing, and thus a manly one. Second, the object attracts, addresses, and dominates the viewer. The viewer is then found desiring and are being manipulated by the object, and they are now possessed by it, as designed by public and private erotic images on various mediums throughout the Roman capital. Consequently, the study interprets the representation of most barbarian women as one that is sexually charged based on active and passive gestures, more of which will be discussed now. So active and passive gestures afforded to the women indicate types of action such as clemency, begging the Roman general for mercy, mourning and despondency, and then trophy display. These captive women are either sat or kneeling. They're rarely standing, just in a few pieces are they standing. They hold their hands in the head in their hands, or they have their hands up, open palms up to the general. The majority of women, in addition to the gesture of kneeling submission, have disheveled hair, a ripped tunic, and an exposed breast, all of which stand to express social anxiety of uncontrolled female sexuality. So to dive into a little bit more of what one of the gestures an exposed breast means, the showing of one bare breast on female figures became a popular visual symbol dating back to the 5th century in Greece. It creates a potent allusion to the naked female body, making its literal representation one that was carefully contained and regulated by the male artist. This imagery finds its popularity in Amazonoctomy scenes in the High Classical period in Greece from 450 to 400 BC. This was regarded as the peak of development in the classical tradition, with a refined expression of the Greek view of their gods and men. Amazons who are victorious have their breasts covered, while the defeated Amazons, or those who are about to be defeated, have their clothing ripped open at one shoulder to expose the breast. This image can be found on a range of Greek media, including marble sarcophagi and red figure pottery. Pavlok astutely comments that for a woman spectator, there's only one message: behave like an Amazon and you will be overcome. This message to the Greek female viewer could also be applied to the Roman female viewer in regard to sexual assault. Behave like a barbarian woman and you will be treated like one. Classical Athenian and early Southern Italian red figure painted faces of female mythical figures in classical tragedy depict the bare breast, a phenomenon that Cohen calls a potent visual convention employed by classical artists to denote female victims of physical violence. This physical violence, however, is one of a sexual nature, and the image of a woman with her breast laid bare from sexual violence can therefore be traced back to Greek society. However, the Romans transformed it to fit into their narrative of controlling the body of the other female, whose eventual fate had a high probability of being raped and sold into sexual slavery. The feelings surrounding the image of a woman exposing her breast regularly is one of a world gone awry, full of unspeakable danger and anxiety. Additionally, it suggests a lack of constraint, used to evoke wildness, in what Ian Ferris describes as a state of uncivilized being outside of the control and knowledge of the Roman experience. This in itself is seen as a considerable threat. Ian Ferris also identifies an ambiguity reflected in the bare breast. Women are deemed unclean or polluters, while at the same time inhibit the position of nurturers, mothers, sisters, and wives. Alternatively, the bare breast can be read at face value. The visual aftermath of sexual assault, a warning sign to other women and a reassurance that the captive woman is treated in regulation to Roman societal expectations and wartime norms regarding the captive female. The bare breast, therefore, can be seen to represent a powerful message of anxiety, degradation, sexual vulnerability, and the communal shame from her rape. So the material in Rome that I've looked at are columns, arches, plaster casts, cameos, and sarcophagi. And material from the provinces are specifically arches and trophies, and I will go through an example of one of each. First, in identifying the trafficking, there's 3-step process that is in the art. So there's scenes of capture, scenes of transport, and scenes of triumph. So for an example, scenes of capture from the column of Marcus Aurelius can be seen here. On the left-hand side, we have Roman soldiers pulling and capturing captive Germanic women. Above them, we have a group of women and children being rounded up to be ready to be transported. We have scenes of transport here. A paramount step in the trafficking process is transporting women far away from their homes. This ensures the total separation from everything she knew and prevents her from being able to find her home if she should successfully escape, as most of these women would have never traveled as far as the Roman army would have taken them, and they would not know how to find their way back. They are initially stuck. Trafficked women are also evident in transport tariffs. On the left-hand side, before I get to the tariff, we have Trajan's column. Here we have women offering up their children to Trajan back here and his soldiers. And in the background, you can see a transport ship where they're being led to. So there's evidence for the taxation of prostitutes and sailors' men and soldiers' men in the Koptos tariff that survives from Roman Egypt, a fee charged for the use of the roads between Koptos and the Red Sea. This tariff is further evidence of the trafficking of women across the empire. They are traveling by land and sea and described as the women of sailors, soldiers, or labeled as prostitutes. It is impossible to say definitively that these women listed here were captives of war, but it is highly likely that some among them were. Lastly, we have the trophy and triumph scenes. Here on the frieze from the Temple of Apollo Socianus, we have a Gallic captive pair here sat at the base of a tropaeum being carried on a litter through a triumphal procession. And then on the right-hand side, we have a scene from the frieze, Trajan's Arch of Benevento, of a Gallic family walking in a triumphal procession. There's one example that exemplifies all 3 of these aspects of trafficking, and that's on a marble battle sarcophagi from the Vatican dating to the 2nd century AD. On the right-hand side, we see the victorious general accepting the clemency and supplication of the male barbarian. And on the left-hand side, we see a Roman soldier offering clemency in a scene of capture of a wet nurse actually with her exposed breast and the child that she's looking after. On the left-hand side of the sarcophagus, we have another woman and child sat in mourning and despondency on a wagon being transported back to wherever she's going to be taken and sold. And on the right-hand side, we have a group of women sat on top of a litter being carried through a triumphal procession. Now I want to talk about an example from the provinces, and I want to quickly go over the wartime scenario of the subjugation of the Gallic Alpine tribes and the Trophy of Augustus at La Turbe. So in 25 BC, the wars against 45 Alpine tribes began, and this was led by Drusus and Tiberius. The subjugation of the Vindelici tribe, which is an Iron Age Celtic people, were particularly feared for their cruelty and brutality. These people groups settled in fortified cities near the Danube, by which Drusus's men stormed many towns and strongholds, with one known siege conducted against the stronghold of a member of the tribe of the Vindelici. Storming towns usually result in the taking of the town's resources, including women. Drusus was looking to conquer the Alpine tribes to expand the Roman control and peace of southern Gaul. As a reminder here, predatory warfare includes assaults against rural communities with little or no fortifications, and in most cases in forms of expansionist conquest, the types of settlements that most of these Alpine tribes lived. The army would move to the next town after depleting another town of its resource. Additionally, the more depleted a region became, the remaining vulnerable inhabitants retreated to a well-defined area with walls and defensive works. This then creates the need for the offensive to conduct a siege with bands of predatory and punitive warriors. As Virgil's Aeneid states, spare those who surrender, but fight to the end the arrogant. In general, siege warfare tactics employed by the Romans were retaliatory and predatory in nature, with growing frustration on the Roman side, especially if it took an extended period to besiege a target city. Women in the besiegement of Masada and Judea, for example, killed their children and themselves out of fear of the horrors that awaited them at the hands of the Roman soldiers. Kieran Reader noted that once the walls were breached and the city was defeated, all inhabitants, soldiers or not, were liable to be killed, raped, pillaged, imprisoned, enslaved, or deported. Similarly, rape was used as a form of punishment for prolonged sieges by Soviet soldiers in Berlin and Budapest during World War II. In this instance, it was troops who came through later during the offensive that were more prone to rape than the initial frontline troops. This is what Madeline Morris terms breakout periods. This is times when soldiers are not engaged in combat and have significant contact with civilians, which creates opportunity. It has been argued that wartime rape during or after a successful siege is consistent with the relationship between engagement and sexual violence, competition, and increased testosterone as a result of competition. Moreover, siege attacks are visible to those being besieged, such as women, children, and the elderly on looking from afar, and those who are doing the besieging, specifically the general of the unit. Levithan notes that this public dimension changes the moral terms of otherwise intimate close combat, and the fact that failures might be witnessed and jeered by non-combatants added to the sense of forced embarrassment. Women who fell victim during the siege warfare then had a high probability of being gang raped due to its punitive nature and made a primary target during the plunder due to motivation and fear of embarrassment and shame should everyone witness the Roman defeat, and to gain payback on the side of the offensive. When predatory informs expansionist goals, the purpose of committing these violent sexual acts is to turn the women into dehumanized and exploitable sexual objects, to be concubines, prostitutes, and slaves to exploit their reproductivity and perform various forms of labor. These are the probable realities faced by the women who belong to the Vindelici tribes, and rape being the first step in their sex trafficking. So we'll keep that in mind as we go towards the trophy here. So the defeat of the tribes was celebrated on the Trophy of Augustus at La Turbe. No doubt from the inscription recorded in Pliny and the Res Gestae that the conquest of the Alpine people was deemed to be a just war. Built in 7 or 6 BC, the trophy was dedicated to Augustus by the Senate and people of Rome in the Maritime Alps and the hills rising from Saint-Tropez. The monument was visible from land and sea with an inscription on the western facade of the rectangular base that lists the 45 subjugated Alpine tribes. The trophy had geographic significance, and according to Ian Ferris, stood in a major node in the provincial road system and in an area where cultural and political and military concerns met and overlapped in the late Republic and early Empire. The monument can be viewed as a territorial marker in and of the landscape, and act as a statement to Augustus's military and political achievements. Now, there are two friezes that survive frame the dedicatory inscription. They depict a tropaeum with a captive man and woman chained at the base. It is important to note that only in a mythological setting do captive women appear chained. So we have a rare image here of chained captive women, specifically in the province. Both women have unbound thick hair. They have crossed arms and are chained at the wrists and kneel on one knee. The frieze on the left-hand side of the inscription, in the left side here in this image, has the captive woman placed on the left side of the tropaeum, making her one border of the entire ensemble of the image and the facade. Alternatively, the right-hand side frieze has the woman on the right-hand side of the tropaeum, effectively making her the other side of the border of this image and inscription. Together, they both frame the Roman masculinity. A statue of Augustus may have been present on top of the trophy with a captive barbarian at his feet, appealing for clemency. This clemency being related to what Wolff calls the growing consciousness that Romans were destined by the gods to conquer, rule, and civilize the world. However, there are no scenes of clemency with regard to the captive woman on these trophies in these scenes. Perhaps only male barbarians were worthy of being granted clemency or seen accepting clemency in the provinces. Feminist film theory provides a fresh approach to understanding the male gaze and to help us better understand why these artistic choices were made in the context of the Alpine women. The application of feminist film theory to the viewership of Roman art was applied by N. Cagliostro by using the male gaze concept coined by Laura Mulvey. Laura Mulvey, in her influential work, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, asserts that the socophilia instinct, which is the pleasure that arises in looking at another person as an erotic object, is evident through the focus on the beauty parts of women. Moreover, it is the way the male fetishizes the woman and breaks up her into idealized pieces to destroy her wholeness. This breaking up of women into individual erotic parts gives the viewer more power over the female on display. Cagliostro additionally notes that Mulvey observes that in cinema, women are cut up, as it were, into pretty body parts, and this display constantly disavows gender equality since the parts appear only as idealized fragments of a whole. She goes on to say that the male viewer thereby escapes from the danger of confronting the full complexity of woman, for she would certainly threaten his own power and status if she were a whole person. This breaking up of the desirable body parts is what the artist of the Alpine women has done by accentuating her exposed breast. The placement of the left woman here, head looking out and up, effectively directs the viewer's gaze directly in the direction of the exposed breast and chest, her vulnerability. This then creates an erotic male gaze. The male viewer can obtain pleasure from looking at her because this form of presentation protects men from feeling of inferiority in their power and status. The very expression of her unkempt hair and pulled tunic reveal her bare breast and shoulder represent the sexual assault that befell the Alpine captive women. Lastly, both friezes are best visible from the ground since they border the inscription, the accessibility to passersby being a potent feature. It is also one of the most significant monuments in this study that prominently features the captive woman. With the trophies strategically placed in a provincial road system that moved the Roman army, most viewers plausibly would have been soldiers and the odd merchant, tradesman, or slaver headed to Italy or other provinces. The local population would have been forced to confront these images while traveling the area on a monument that dominated the landscape. The trophy at La Turbie then represents the naturalization of Roman conquest. Furthermore, it represents the naturalization of the display of sexually assaulted local and regional non-Roman women. If the trophy represents the naturalization of conquest, it also naturalizes wartime rape in the provinces and its depiction in monumental art. So in conclusion, the captive women in Roman art is on a variety of mediums, large and small, private and public. Her presence is representative of two things. First, the visual trope and metaphor for the capture, subjugation, submission, and attempted acculturation and absorption of the formidable foreign foe and its reproductive capacity in the family unit. The woman is used as a pawn for men to measure morality on and off the battlefield. Second, the real-life anxieties that surround women in general and the sexualization of captive female and her treatment in real life are also expressed in triumphal art. Captive women from the arena of war were a very real prize for the Roman conquerors and a large part of the economy and the traffic of people and the traffic of captive women for the purpose of sex. They were also important to add to slave labor and were used to produce more children or homeborn slaves. Rome is not only dominated physically, but also visually. These two functions overlap, expressing Rome's dominance over the other land and population and the actual captive female herself, revealing anxieties and social attitudes regarding the family, sex, and the foreign other. These captive women will go on to have their identity and sexuality stolen from them to ensure total submission. In his 1997 study, Political Paranoia, the Psychopolitics of Hatred, Robert Robinson states that, quote, by defining ourselves in terms of who we are not, we separate ourselves psychologically from an empathic connection with the enemy, end quote. The conscious choices in how the captive woman's body was represented in Roman conquest art was how the Romans defined who they were not, conquered sexualized property. And it was how they psychologically separated their empathic connection with the enemy. This constant contact with the image of the sexualized captive woman and what they represent would have desensitized the public to the treatment of her body, affording her little to no empathy. Without the body of the captives in Conquest Iconography, we would only have half the picture of the realities endured by the conquered. Without realizing it, the Roman artist has provided us with a sexualized roadmap the captive woman was forced to take from conquest to consumption. Thank you. Here's my bibliography. And I would like to have a special thanks to Professor Maureen Carroll, Dr. Jane Rimple, and Professor Julia Hillner, who have all been crucial in the creation and implementation of this project.